Boy, I'm really milking this specialization topic, aren't I? Though, if you want to blame anyone, blame Togashi-sensei. My man revealed a basic mechanic of one of his 6 major categories after 400 plus chapters and 20 plus years. In chapter 408, the fake Morena Prudo revealed that specialists do not have a standard proficiency distribution, which is a notion I've been pushing for years. If you want to know all the reasons that initially led me to thinking that, I invite you to check out the video I made on the topic titled Yes, Specialization is Broken. That's the second video I made on the topic, but it contains basically all the information the first one does and is in general much more well made, so you don't need to bother with that initial one. In that video, I concluded that there were 2 possibilities with regards to how specialization's proficiency distribution operated. 1. Each specialist had their own unchangeable and unique proficiency distribution, based on their personality, level of talent, and awakened Hatsu. This would have meant that those specialists, like Bakunoda, whose mind-reading ability required mainly specialization to work, would have a rather limited proficiency distribution in the other 5 categories. While those specialists, who for example acquired the abilities of others, like Crollo, would have had a near 100% proficiency in all categories. Or 2, specialization was actually entirely outside the system, and everything a specialist did would fall under the umbrella of specialization. This would have meant that the very act of Crollo materializing his bandit secret would be accomplished through specialization and not conjuration. Now, having realized this would mean that specialization would either be pretty overpowered in the case of an idiosyncratic proficiency distribution, or even more overpowered in the case that specialization was outside the system and that specialists did everything through it, I postulated a notion that would have balanced out both, but especially the second idea. See, specialization isn't defined by a core category mechanic, the way enhancement, which strengthens specific properties of a person or object, or manipulation, which allows for the control of people or objects, are. Instead, it's defined by the fact that it doesn't have a core ability mechanic, making it possible for the user to manifest entirely unique or incredibly complex abilities not limited by any categorical constraints. As such, I postulated the idea that specialists don't really develop, but more awaken their Hatsu, and that the core mechanics of each specialist's Hatsu are essentially predetermined or pre-wired. This for a few reasons, but mainly because a specialist's Hatsu was implied to be the unfiltered and unconstrained representation of the very core of their character and personality. Having identity issues, you awaken an ability that allows you to vicariously identify with another person by understanding their stolen ability. Want to understand people on a deeper level and find out whether the boy you like really likes you back because you're insecure and he's a living enigma? Awaken a mind-reading ability, and so on. In this way, while they'd potentially still be rather overpowered when compared to the other categories, at least they'd be limited in what abilities they could develop and wouldn't really be able to perfectly optimize a Hatsu for whatever purpose or niche the individual NEN user had in mind. Now, while it was confirmed that specialists indeed do not have a standard proficiency distribution, neither of my 2 propositions were exactly on the mark, because specialists allegedly enjoy an unconstrained 100% proficiency in all categories. They do not have a unique distribution individual to every specialist, nor are they outside the system. Furthermore, it's pretty obvious at this point that my notion of specialists awakening rather than developing their Hatsu isn't a universal property of specialists, but a rare occurrence in certain NEN geniuses such as 4th Prince Terror Sandwich. How do we know this? Because Morena needs Bork to develop a specific specialist ability in order to put her plan for killing all the passengers on the Black Whale and getting revenge on the Kaki nobility into motion. If specialists universally came essentially pre-wired with the core mechanics and theme of their abilities, to which they could only make superficial or peripheral changes, such as Crollo did with Bandit Secret in order to prepare for his deathmatch against Hisoka, Morena's goal wouldn't be to just find any specialist, but one with a very specific innate ability. However, Morena's explanation on how specialization works, along with the fact that she never tested Bork for her core or ability, and further threaten her by explicitly warning Bork that any specialist would do, very obviously points to the fact that specialists are in general free to develop any ability of their choosing. Very quickly, I'd like to address one important aspect of this revelation: the veracity and reliability of Morena's claims. This information was given to us through a character and not an omniscient narrator or Togashi himself, leaving room for us to question the reliability of Morena's claims. What if I'm actually correct and every specialist does indeed have a proficiency distribution unique to them, and that Morena, as one of those particularly gifted specialists, simply projected and generalized her own individual experience with and capacity for specialization onto the category as a whole? While not literally impossible, it's highly unlikely. Morena's been preparing for this for quite some time, and she's motivated and intelligent enough where I don't believe she'd make such a rudimentary error. I'm sure she's met, and possibly even infected, a reasonable number of specialists with her contagion, until now, and tested out their capacity for creating variously complex and unique Hatsu. The only part of her research she was uncertain about was the exact distribution of the 6 Nan categories among the wider populace, since perhaps her sample size wasn't quite representative enough for her to make definitive claims with absolute certainty. By the way, just the fact that she apparently has a reasonably representative sample size implies that she has had the opportunity to encounter a fair number of specialists throughout her life and career as a doomsday aficionado. This, together with the fact that her plan relies on specialization working in the way she purported, makes it so that her claims with regards to specialization's properties are far more likely to be correct than not. Finally, this conceptualization of specialization tracks with everything we've seen in the series thus far. From Chrollo's enhancer-like durability against Zeno and Silva, to Kurapika's claims that being revealed as a specialist tells your opponent basically nothing about your strengths or weaknesses. As such, it's quite reasonable to assume that Morena's claim that specialists have a total proficiency distribution in all categories is indeed true. Let's linger on that proficiency point for just a moment. As you may recall, proficiency is actually the combination of 3 different parameters, namely level, force, and accuracy. Kurapika is a pseudo-specialist, being able to gain a 100% boost to his force in all other categories, while his level and accuracy distribution remain the same as with any standard conjurer. This means that while he can't create super advanced or complex abilities in a category like emission, those abilities he could create would be significantly more potent. Now, I've seen it brought up in the comment section that maybe regular specialists don't actually have a total proficiency in all categories, but instead only don't have any restrictions with regards to the level of abilities they can develop, while their force and accuracy distribution remain standard. i.e., while specialists would be able to create any ability an innate user of any other category could, it wouldn't be as potent as theirs. While, again, not literally impossible, this is highly unlikely. Morena explicitly said that the only limitation and potential downside of specialists is that they may not realize that they are specialists, and as such may solely focus on 1 or 2 categories and develop abilities as if they were mechanically constrained by them, even though they never were. Furthermore, as I said just a moment ago, if specialists were limited in force and or accuracy, that would have meant that their enhancement capabilities would be really weak, since enhancement level doesn't really matter for basic enhancement, and with only a 40% force and accuracy in it, they'd have the definitive and inherent weakness of their users being the squishiest amongst the 6 categories, which would go against Crow's performance against the Zoldyx and Kurapika's aforementioned claims. With all that said, the reason I quickly dismissed and never put forward the notion that specialists had full proficiency in all categories, despite it having for a brief moment crossed my mind when I was making both of those aforementioned videos, is because because it would mean that specialization would be pretty goddamn overpowered and the objectively best category. While my specialist being outside the system notion seems like it amounts to the same thing, I only put that idea forward if it was also true that specialists awakened a Hatsu that represented the unfiltered manifestation of their personality, rather than being free to develop their Hatsu in the same way as the users of the other 5 categories. This would then serve as a potent limiting factor. To explain further, if specialists were outside the system, it would mean that a specialist wouldn't be able to get tougher or stronger by simply tapping into enhancement like it was their innate category, since they wouldn't have access to it, but would be limited in how much their nen could mimic the properties of enhancement depending on the combativeness of their personality and consequently the properties of their abilities. For example, while someone like Crollo, who enjoys combat and whose Hatsu should require the usage of all categories, would be very durable, someone like Paku, whose personality and Hatsu are not combat-oriented, would be rather fragile. Training and talent would be massive factors as well, of course, but that's a given. The focus for me was always on its users being specialized for a specific purpose, and not on them being outright special. As things stand, there's literally no room for argumentation on the point that specialization is overpowered and objectively the supreme category. The only weakness for an individual specialist Morena could name is that it often happens that specialists don't realize they're special and overly focus on one of the other 5 categories, perhaps thinking they're constrained by its mechanics and limitations. How that exactly happens, I'm not sure, by the way. Perhaps the water divination technique isn't as widely known in Kakin as it is in other areas, so other, less reliable methods are employed to determine one's category. Or maybe the water divination ritual itself can be misleading. As in, since specialists produce a unique effect when they undergo the ritual, perhaps this effect can be similar enough to the ones the 5 standard categories produce, such as increasing the volume of the water in case of enhancers, or changing its taste in the case of transmuters. For example, a less experienced Nen user might have interpreted 4th Prince Terror Sandwich turning the water rancid as him being a particularly potent transmuter. In any case, even in those instances where a specialist is falsely identified as a member of another category and invests all their time in mastering it, he or she is really not at a substantial loss. The neat thing about specialization is that it's essentially impossible to squander your potential and overload your Nen memory in the same way Castro did, since there's no loss of energy or potency when specialists tap into other categories because, as established, they can use them at the same levels of proficiency and efficiency as their innate users. A specialist that focused all his efforts on enhancement, thinking himself an enhancer, could match Uvogin in strength and power if he had the same level of talent and work ethic. The only potential loss for this hypothetical specialist would be that he didn't have to take the pure enhancer route the same way Uvogin did, and could have developed or branched out his abilities and skill set in a direction that would have potentially complemented his particular personality and fighting style to an even more intimate degree, which is barely a downside when you consider the limitations of the other 5 regular categories. To bring this point about specialization's overpoweredness home, consider that specialists not only have the capacity to manifest effects not possible through any other category, e.g. terror's precognition, but also the option to mix and match categories to fully optimize their Hatsu, e.g. Crollo's bandit secret. Now, we've known about its capacity to produce entirely unique effects ever since the category was introduced. After all, it was literally specialization's defining feature for over 2 decades. However, the fact that specialists can not only produce entirely unique effects, but also use all categories at 100% efficiency, means that specialists get to have their cake and eat it too. And it's goddamn delicious. Their capacity to use all categories at 100% 100% means that they have the potential to be objectively superior to any other nen user of the same skill level, but particularly those who even think of tapping into categories other than their innate one to produce their Hatsu, which, by the way, is the vast majority of nen users. To give a concrete example, just imagine if Shalnark wasn't a manipulator, but a specialist that nonetheless chose to develop his Hatsu, Black Voice. The part of Black Voice that allowed Shal to control other people remotely through his phone would remain largely unchanged. Maybe he could add an additional needle, but maybe not. However, what would see an amazing boost would be his enhancement-based autopilot mode. As a specialist, he would have had a 100% proficiency in enhancement, instead of a mere 60% proficiency as a manipulator. Considering autopilot mode is already pretty damned powerful as is, this would have meant that as a specialist, Shal could have reached, or most likely even surpassed, the heights of Uvo at his peak. For a short while, at least. Just imagine an opponent thinking he's fighting a manipulator, only for Shal to turn into a Super Saiyan enhancer in an instant and blitz and obliterate him in a single punch. Name any nen user that uses at least one other category apart from their innate one, and you'd be able to give them an objective and meaningful power boost by turning them into a specialist. This is not to even mention those like Zeno or Moral that utilize 3 or 4 categories. Though, to a lesser extent, the same argument goes for those users who choose to go all in their innate category, since a pure enhancer like Uvogin would have at least had the option to develop his fighting style in a way regular enhancers wouldn't, while still maintaining all the benefits of being an enhancer. Now, while this isn't important for an individual specialist, it does help that specialists are supposed to be quite rare, with approximately only 1 in 3,000 people being one. Despite this tremendous rarity, as a friend of mine noted, we've seen a fair number of specialists throughout the series, the sheer number of which would indicate that the ratio is far closer to a 1 in 60 than a 1 in 3,000. However, the story, of course, focuses on special people under special circumstances, pun intended, so it's at least explainable in this way why the ratio of specialists is so skewed when viewed from the viewer's or reader's perspective, and may not be reflective of the actual statistics. Our sample size simply is neither large nor indiscriminate enough. Pair that with the fact that specialists tend to actually be viewed as being special in some way by the people around them, making them potentially more likely to eventually come across and learn Nen. All in all, Morena's revelation means that those people lucky enough to be born into this category are without a doubt privileged when compared to the members of any other. Specialization is objectively the most flexible, versatile, and potent category by every metric imaginable. As a final note, I'm personally not sure how to feel about this. While it feels nice to be vindicated and proven right after years of pushing for and advancing the notion of specialist having a non-standard proficiency distribution, I don't think I like being proven right in this way. I completely understand the sentiments of those of you who previously insisted that specialization had to have a standard proficiency distribution, since then the unprecedented unpredictability and flexibility of specialization would have been balanced out by its paltry proficiency in enhancement, making specialists into versatile wildcard glass cannons against whom you need to tread very carefully, but would at least know you could take advantage of their lack of toughness. In this way, they would have made for the perfect mechanical and thematic counter to enhancers who would basically be the opposite, i.e. incredibly potent physical fighters with very predictable and straightforward abilities. While I do agree that that would have made the category more balanced than it is now, it was obvious to me that that simply wasn't how Togashi conceptualized it. In his mind, specialization isn't just another category. Its members are, and have always been, special. I just never expected him to make them this special. Now it really does feel like specialization is overly optimized when compared to the other categories, but it's especially egregious when it's compared to manipulation and conjuration. Specialization not only blocks them from having a second adjacent category with an 80% proficiency, but also makes these two categories feel far weaker and insubstantial following this revelation. These are the two categories whose users most commonly incorporate other categories as a part of their skill set and Hatsu, meaning that almost any Hatsu a conjurer or manipulator could create, a specialist could, in the vast majority of cases, make it so that it's far more efficient and potent while undergoing fewer restrictions, conditions, and pledges. There are a few more things I believe are worth a mention or analysis regarding this revelation, but I'll tackle them in separate videos. The next video will be directly related to this topic as well. So, do you guys agree? While I generally like to invite discussion in these outros, I genuinely don't think there's much of an argument to be had here. Unless there's a soft retcon, it's nigh impossible to argue that specialization as a category isn't overpowered, even if an individual specialist, such as Baku, may not be. It really all comes down to talent and dedication. No other limiting factors, for an individual, apply. As always, thank you very much for watching. Your feedback is always appreciated. Subscribe if you'd like more content like this. I'd very much like to thank Hamaswamy and Matt B for going the extra mile in supporting the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.